All right. Hello. So this is an extended version of a paper I'm giving for a upcoming conference on the immaterial. So here we go. When considering the nature or function of the immaterial, I think it's useful to give some general background on a position that's often attacked our common sense beliefs in immaterial entities, such as the mind. I'm talking about behaviorism. Today I'm going to go through some aspects of what can be called behavioristic anti-dualism, and I'll explain what this means presently. And the painting, by the way, on my title screen there is by Harry Kidd, Kidd, is a favorite painter of one of the behaviorists I'll talk about. So the philosopher and historian A.O. Lovejoy thought that future historians would consider the early 20th century to be the age of the Great Revolt against dualism. He wrote this in a book published in 1930. In fact, the 1930s were possibly the climax of a first revolt against dualism, the second, at least in the US, the English-speaking world maybe. A second climax would occur in the 1970s, and I suspect we're building up to a third climax presently. The schools of thought involved in the first revolt went by various names. I'm going to use the term behaviorism as a coverall or catch-all since it's more descriptive, it's more readily understood by people than other labels. I'm suggesting that there were three big waves of anti-dualistic behaviorism, two of which have already run their course. So the first part of my talk focuses more on someone from the first wave. The second part gets a little more into the second wave. So behaviorism is part of a revolt against dualism, but first of all, what is dualism? There are actually two forms, or at least two forms, of dualism that history gave to European and American philosophers: epistemological dualism and ontological dualism. Epistemological dualism makes a break between the knower and the known, the subject and the object. In other words, we can't know the outside world directly. I'm not going to deal with epistemological dualism here. Depending on how you interpret it, some behaviorists were epistemological dualists and some weren't. Instead, I'm going to deal with ontological or psychophysical dualism or substance dualism. These terms kind of mean the same thing. This is the view that reality is divided into two kinds of stuff: mind or soul or spirit on the one hand, and matter on the other. Behaviorists were actually also divided somewhat on this question. We sometimes speak of methodological and metaphysical behaviorism. Methodological behaviorism simply ignores mind for the purposes of scientific investigation into behavior. So it doesn't necessarily take a stance on the ontological status of the mind. And I'm not really going to deal with methodological behaviorism here. Metaphysical behaviorists, on the other hand, have wanted to show that mind is material or physical. They have argued that there is only one kind of stuff in the universe, and that people are made out of the same kind of stuff as everything else. We might describe their project as trying to show how matter can know about itself. So my subject matter here is metaphysical behaviorism as a form of anti-ontological dualism, or maybe ontological anti-dualism, the correct term might be. So what is the reason for metaphysical behaviorism? In a word, I would say science. What is accepted as fact in science is what can be empirically demonstrated. It's what is observable to the scientific community. Hypothetical entities do sometimes come into scientific theory, but there is always the expectation that these entities are made of the same kind of stuff, the same kind of fundamental stuff as observable entities. And there's always also the expectation that sometime, somehow, these entities will become observable. The atom is a good example. The existence of atoms was posited long before we had any way to observe them. And while we can't physically see or feel an atom, we do now have tools which effectively tell us that atoms must be there. The atom has become observable in some sense. From a behavioristic perspective, the problem with the dualistic concept of mind is that such a mind is not observable by the ordinary or scientific methods we use to observe everything else. For metaphysical behaviorists, the mind is physical in the same sense that any behavior or bodily process is physical. And there's at least two ways of attacking the problem of dualism. One is through conceptual or verbal analysis. In this approach, you try to analyze the words we use to talk about mind. You could show how they have evolved over time and thus do not have an essential meaning that we can just take for granted today. Or you could show how the words actually function in ordinary discourse. And this often reveals that the words indicate something observable rather than unobservable. The other way of attacking the problem of the materiality of mind is through physiological, behavioral, or sociological analysis. This involves theorizing about or actually observing what the body does when it's engaging in so-called mental processes and how it came to be able to do those things, to have mental processes. Many and possibly most behaviorists use both of these techniques. I'll focus on a couple of theorists here, mainly. The first that I'm going to talk about is Edgar A. Singer. The clearest early statement of metaphysical behaviorism that I know of was given by Edgar A. Singer, Jr., and he used both conceptual and behavioral analysis. Now, Singer is not very well known today, but in terms of his ideas, he's extremely important. He was, however, following the path of William James, who you also see on my screen there. James was perhaps the first really well-known philosopher and psychologist in the United States. In fact, Singer had been an assistant to James early in Singer's career. James and Singer were both partially following and partially critiquing the British empiricists, an older school of philosophy. The British empiricists thought that our knowledge of the world came mainly through experience, the idea of empiricism. Knowledge comes through experience. But the British empiricists tended to assume that the mind which does the knowing was a non-material substance. They were ontological or substance dualists. They thought we can't know other people's minds empirically, so it must be a non-empirical kind of entity. William James and E. A. Singer, though, wanted to extend empiricism to the mind. James would call his philosophy radical empiricism, while Singer, because he was heavily influenced by Kant, called his philosophy empirical idealism. This is from one of his essay collections, one of his books. Singer's first important writing on this topic is an essay of 1910 called Mind as an Observable Object. This is a short but very powerful essay, which I highly recommend taking a look at. In this paper, Singer draws on both of the approaches I've mentioned, conceptual or verbal analysis and behavioral sociological analysis. Singer is basically wrestling with the classic problem of other minds, which has been addressed by many, many people. This is the problem of whether we can be sure that other people have minds, have perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, just as we ourselves have perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. The problem of other minds goes back at least to the skepticism Descartes raised about whether we can truly know about the external world. But it was an especially important topic in the 19th and 20th centuries. One of the classic arguments for the existence of other minds is the argument from analogy. If you don't know the argument from analogy, It goes like this. So I know that when I act, I have certain mental states, perceptions, thoughts, feelings. Therefore, when I observe other people act like I act, I can infer that they too have mental states. In other words, the argument from analogy is an argument for the existence of other minds. Now, Singer gives a few arguments against the argument from analogy. I want to mention two of them. The first is social. The argument from analogy assumes that you are in the best position to know your own mental states. But Singer argues this goes against many ordinary experiences in which other people seem to know our mental states better than we know them. In fact, we only know our own mental states because of socialization. One example he gives is colorblindness. If you are born colorblind, you won't necessarily know it until someone notices that you respond to certain colored objects differently than other people. Maybe your parents would notice this, or your teachers. Other people know you're colorblind before you yourself do. This logic can be extended to pretty much all other so-called mental states, such as hunger or love. This is a social behavioral argument about the observability of the mind. It also has a conceptual component, however, because Singer is arguing that society labels our mental states for us based on our behavior. We come to know our perceptions, thoughts, and feelings because society gives us special concepts to do so. So anyway, in his view, the argument from analogy doesn't work. The next argument I want to mention involves what Singer calls the additive instinct, or the instinct to add. This also involves both behavioral and conceptual analysis. The additive instinct seems to be a deeply rooted way we humans have of thinking about things. For example, we used to think that a hot object was a combination of two objects. The object itself and heat. You add them together, you get a hot object. Nowadays, we understand that heat is not a separate substance that we can add to an object to make a new kind of object. A hot object is just an object under certain environmental conditions, in interaction with organisms capable of responding to it. So it's an object that has had the movements of its particles sped up through interaction with other particles, which is interpreted by some organism as hotness, as heat, a feeling of heat. Likewise, it was once thought that a person was a material or mechanical body to which an immaterial soul or mind was added. This is basically the position of Aristotle or Descartes. The soul could be separated from the body, for example, at death, and maintain its own existence. Some people still believe this, talk about uploading their minds to computers and stuff like that. Nowadays, the scientist would want to say that a living being is like a heated object, just an organization of matter under certain environmental conditions. So anyway, if you accept this logic, the additive instinct, like the argument from analogy, just doesn't work. Still, this scientific view is not very popular outside of scientific circles. Even William James could not quite accept this, and he argued that it made a difference whether or not we thought a person had a soul. You would not feel the same way about someone if you thought they didn't have a soul. But for Singer, this just raises the conceptual behavioral question. How do we know whether or not someone has a soul? What exactly do we mean by soul? Singer's argument was, again, that this can only rest on the observation of behavior. If we say that a person does or does not have a soul, this is not because we somehow know that they have had an immaterial soul object or a special soul substance added to or subtracted from them. We say this because of how they act, and how they act is a matter of public observation. The words we have available and the words we have available for talking about people based on their actions is a matter of cultural history maintained through society. So this is all public and observable stuff. And actually, I have a picture there from the Stepford Wives, the movie version of the Stepford Wives. But actually, Ira Levin's book, The Stepford Wives, was partly a response to behaviorism, especially the behaviorism of B.F. Skinner, who was kind of famous at the time. But it's ironic in this book and in the movie too, that the husbands actually like their wives better when they become what William James criticized as automatic sweethearts, or what today we would call robots. So William James thought you would not like your wife if she turned out to be, a robot or soulless. But Ira Levin's critique was that maybe men would actually like this. So anyway, Singer declined to say in his 1910 paper exactly which behaviors lead us to attribute a mind or consciousness to organisms. Why exactly do we say that some organisms are conscious? He would have more to say about this in later essays with titles such as On Sensibility and On the Conscious Mind. But the basic behavioristic procedure was set. If you want to know about mental states, you should look at 1, the history of the words we use to talk about them, and 2, the observable behaviors in response to which we are taught to use those words. This, in a nutshell, would also become the philosophy of B.F. Skinner, who was possibly unaware of Singer, but nevertheless converged on many of the same ideas. All right, so Singer was formulating a way in which mind could be understood in terms of overt behaviors you can normally observe. At the same time, however, physiologists were starting to study the bodily processes that occurred during covert behaviors, or which constituted covert behaviors you can't normally observe with the naked eye. This happened rather by accident. So the dominant experimental psychology in the late 19th and early 20th century was introspectionism. Introspectionism had been brought to American universities by E.B. Titchener, you see in the middle there, an Englishman who had studied in Germany with Wilhelm Wundt, you see on the upper left. Introspective experiments involved subjects reporting on their mental experiences when presented with various stimuli. So the investigator would show you something and you'd try to report your mental experience. Edmund Jacobson, on the bottom right there, was a student of Titchener. Jacobson had noticed as a young man that changes of muscle tension always accompanied his mental activity. So when he had a thought or a perception, there was some change to his muscle tension. Many others had suspected this before, and there were attempts to measure the muscle activity involved. But in the late 1920s, Jacobson, working with Bell Laboratories, became the first to develop a sensitive enough instrument to do so accurately, to accurately measure these really tiny muscle changes that you have when you are, for example, thinking or dreaming. It was called the neurovoltmeter. And there's a picture for you, a picture of it. The use of the neurovoltmeter led to a series of articles in 1930 and 1931 on electrical measurements of neuromuscular states during mental activities. Such experiments also led to the development of what is now called progressive muscle relaxation, or what Jacobson just called progressive relaxation. Jacobson's experiments on mental activities and relaxation showed that not only did muscle action potentials, the neural signals to and from the muscles, not only did these occur during mental activities, but subjects were unable to inhibit muscle action potentials during mental activities. So if you have a mental activity, these things just happen. You can't stop them from happening. Nervous excitation of the skeletal muscles appeared to be necessary to thought, imagination, and memory. The question was, what was the function of this excitation of the muscles? Edmund Jacobson had no, or very few, philosophical pretensions. His comments on the broader implications of his work tended to be terse and conceptually, I would say, underdeveloped. Though he criticized both monism and dualism, the monistic implications of his work can be seen in statements such as, imagination is in fact a minute bodily act. I suppose Jacobson would be called an aspect dualist. Though it uses the word dualism, aspect dualism just says that mental processes seem to be different sorts of things depending on whether you focus on their physiology or on the actual experience. This is sometimes described as a difference between third-person or first-person perspectives. The physiological processes can be observed and measured by another person, so the physiology part can be observed and measured by someone else, while the experience can only be described by the experiencer herself. From a third-person perspective, mental activity is just circuits of signals between the brain and the musculature. The resulting muscle tensions can be felt as such by an attentive subject. You can feel these changes in muscle tension, but their meaning is a result of their integration through the brain. And it's worth pointing out that this integration cannot be felt as such since we don't have the right kind of nerves in the brain. The meaning of these neuromuscular signals is the actual experience we have of, say, a thought or a memory. Though he was not quite a behaviorist, Jacobson's main breakthroughs occurred during the first wave of behaviorism in the early 1900s. The work of his disciple, F.J. McGuigan, occurred during the second wave in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, especially around the 70s. I couldn't find a picture of him. McGuigan, or at least a good picture, McGuigan associated himself with behaviorism. So Jacobson was kind of ambivalent about behaviorism. McGuigan specifically associated himself with behaviorism and understood his work as part of the history of behaviorism. He was also clearer in his philosophical foundations, which were resolutely physicalist. So he stated, mental processes are sequences of bodily events which occur under specifiable external and internal conditions, and nothing more. In principle, once we have measured all of these bodily events, we have completely specified the mental processes in question. So we've measured the mental processes, right? We measured the processes, but what about the meaning of that process for the individual? In other words, yes, we can measure the specific combinations of bodily events that occur when mental processes are assumed to be occurring, but can we measure the qualitative experience, the qualia, had by the person to whom these bodily events belong? McGuigan was not entirely explicit on this point, but his answer seemed to be that we could, in principle, if not in actual practice, build up a dictionary of bodily events. These are some other pictures from McGuigan's writings. So for example, we could determine that neuromuscular circuit A represents the word book. So neuromuscular circuit being a pattern of activity involving the brain and the peripheral nervous system, the central and peripheral nervous system, circling around, kind of a feedback. So we could determine that neuromuscular circuit A represents the word book, neuromuscular circuit B represents the perception of the object book, and neuromuscular circuit C represents the sensation of the color of the book, and so on. Such translational technologies have, of course, long been speculated on. And here is McGuigan's depiction of a thought-reading machine. In this picture, there's the SL is a linguistic stimulus, and there's a linguistic response. So the subject here perceives a linguistic stimulus as a thought, and then based on the muscle activity, it's translated into text there. So you can see that in McGuigan's view, thought involves muscles all over the body. Mental activity involves muscles all over the body. This is a more recent version that would be localized to the throat. Would probably be less successful because that's only part of part of the stuff. Part of the body where that determines the sound of a word is the throat. But of course, the lips and the tongue also determine the sound of words. So you would need to capture those somehow. I don't know if this would be able to capture what is going on in your mouth. It's supposed to be on your throat, I guess. So probably, I don't think it would perhaps work that well. But if you want something more discrete, that's a way to go. That's a kind of technology maybe to develop. So different a different kind of thing than McGuigan's. McGuigan recognized that you had to monitor many different areas of the body to read someone's mental activities. But this seems to be ignored by a lot of modern researchers. Anyway, the possibility of these sorts of technologies depends on minds being material. The possibility of these mind-reading machines, thought-reading machines, this depends on having a material mind, a mind that is material. All right, so that's all I wanted to talk about in this little talk about materializing the immaterial, how the mind has been becoming progressively more material. All right, well, thank you for listening and have a great day.